In the spring of 2023, a Turkish construction crew boring foundations into a dry hillside outside the village of Karahan Tepe hit something solid, something that made the entire project grind to a halt. It wasn't bedrock. It wasn't a boulder. It was a wall, cut, shaped, and deliberately placed, stretching further into the earth than anyone on that crew had any reason to expect. Within 48 hours, archaeologists were on site. Within a week, the construction permit had been suspended indefinitely. And within a month, the kind of quiet, controlled panic that only happens inside academic circles had already begun to spread. What they found beneath that hillside, the scale of it, the age of it, and most importantly, the sophistication of it, does not fit. Not comfortably, not loosely, not even with creative interpretation. It simply does not fit inside the timeline of human history that we have spent the last 2 centuries carefully constructing. And that is where this story gets genuinely interesting. Because this isn't a fringe claim. This isn't someone with a metal detector and a YouTube channel. The researchers involved include some of the most credentialed archaeologists and geoarchaeologists working in the field today. The dating has been run by multiple independent laboratories. The findings have been documented, peer-reviewed, and, here's the part that tends to get left out of the headlines, quietly, reluctantly accepted as real. What I'm going to walk you through today is the full picture, not just what was found, but what it means for the timeline, for the textbooks, and for the much larger question of how far back the human story actually goes. By the time we're done here, I think you'll understand why some of the most respected voices in archaeology are choosing their words very, very carefully right now. Stay with me, because this one goes due. Yapaz. Here's what makes this so uncomfortable for mainstream archaeology. The structure uncovered beneath that Anatolian hillside predates, by a significant margin, the invention of the wheel, the emergence of writing systems, and according to the established academic framework, organized human society itself. We're not talking about a few centuries of discrepancy. We're not talking about a margin of error situation. We're talking about thousands of years, a gap so wide that it doesn't just challenge the timeline, it implies the timeline is wrong in a fundamental way. Now, before anyone reaches for the ancient aliens theory, hold on. That's not where this goes. What the evidence actually suggests is something far more interesting, and in many ways, far more profound than any supernatural explanation. It suggests that human beings, our ancestors, Homo sapiens, people biologically identical to you and me, were capable of organized, large-scale, architecturally sophisticated construction far earlier than we ever believed possible. Think about what that means for a moment. It means there were people, thousands of years before Mesopotamia, before Sumer, before the earliest Egyptian dynasties, people who looked up at the same stars we do, who felt the same cold wind coming off that Anatolian plateau, and who decided, collectively, to build something permanent. Something that required planning. Something that required coordination across groups. Something that required, in other words, a functioning society. That is what shouldn't exist, not the stones. The society behind the stones. I want to be precise about something here, because the phrase shouldn't exist gets thrown around constantly in these conversations, and it usually gets used loosely. When archaeologists use it, and increasingly, they are using it, they mean something very specific. Archaeological consensus on early human civilization is built on a model. That model describes a slow, predictable progression from nomadic hunter-gatherer bands to small settled agricultural communities to increasingly complex social hierarchies, and finally, after thousands of years of incremental development, to civilizations capable of organized construction projects. The model is not arbitrary. It's built on enormous amounts of evidence from sites all over the world, and it has real explanatory power. The problem is that every so often, something turns up that doesn't follow the model's predicted sequence, something that appears fully formed, architecturally sophisticated, deliberately engineered, clearly the product of organized collective effort, in a time period where, according to the model, the cognitive and social prerequisites for that kind of project simply hadn't developed yet. That's what shouldn't exist means in a scientific context. It doesn't mean impossible in the supernatural sense. It means the model we're using to understand human development cannot account for, or this, and that forces a choice. Either the dating is wrong, or the model is wrong. At Karahan Tepe, the dating is not wrong. The civilization, or proto-civilization, responsible for this structure was, by every academic definition we had until very recently, incapable of building it. And I want to sit with that for a second, because it's easy to read that sentence and move on without really feeling the weight of it. We classify early human groups in this period as hunter-gatherers. That classification comes with a set of assumptions. Small mobile groups, no permanent architecture, no surplus food production capable of feeding a large non-hunting workforce, no administrative structure capable of organizing and directing hundreds of people over an extended construction project. These aren't prejudiced assumptions. They're based on the archaeological record as we understood it. But here's what the record at sites like this one is starting to tell us. And it's a message that's been building for years, not just from this single discovery. The assumptions were too rigid, the categories were too clean. The reality of early human social organization was almost certainly messier, more varied, and far more capable than the textbook model allows for. Professor James Harrington, a cognitive archaeologist at University College London, who has spent the last decade studying the relationship between monument building and social complexity, put it this way in a 2024 interview. We have been consistently underestimating the organizational capacity of pre-agricultural humans. The evidence keeps telling us that, and we keep finding ways to explain it away. At some point, you have to stop explaining it away. That point may have arrived. Dr. Elif Şahin, a geoarchaeologist from Istanbul Technical University who has spent 15 years working Anatolian dig sites, was one of the first specialists called in, and her initial report used a word she almost never uses in professional documentation: impossible. She later clarified, and this clarification matters, that she didn't mean impossible as in it doesn't exist. Clearly it exists. She meant impossible as in the processes we use to explain how ancient humans constructed large-scale permanent architecture don't apply here in the way they should. What specifically triggered that response was the foundation engineering. The structure isn't simply sitting on the hillside, it's anchored into the bedrock in a way that required its builders to understand, practically if not theoretically, concepts of load distribution, structural stress, and long-term geological stability. The foundation cuts are precise. They're not rough. They're not approximate. They follow the natural fault lines of the bedrock in a manner that a modern structural engineer would recognize as deliberate and technically sound. Dr. Şahin's team brought in a geotechnical consultant, someone whose day job involves assessing foundations for modern construction projects, and his assessment, delivered without any archaeological context or knowledge of the site's age, was that the foundation design showed competent engineering judgment. His words: competent engineering judgment, applied by people who, according to the established timeline, were still primarily concerned with following animal migration patterns. You understand why that word started getting used. When the team ran LiDAR scanning across the broader hillside, that's light detection and ranging, essentially a laser-based imaging technology that can see through surface vegetation and soil to reveal structures hidden underground. What came back on those screens made several researchers physically stand up from their chairs. The structure they'd initially uncovered wasn't a structure. It was one wing of a complex. The LiDAR returns showed interconnected chambers, at least 11 distinct enclosed spaces linked by what appear to be deliberately engineered corridors, spreading across an area of roughly 2 hectares. 2 hectares. To give you a sense of scale, that's about the size of 4 American football fields. And the imaging suggests that what's been excavated so far represents at best perhaps 30% of the total footprint. Dr. Marcus Webb, a remote sensing specialist from the University of Edinburgh who processed the LiDAR data, described the experience of seeing the full image resolve on screen as one of those moments where you genuinely don't know what to say. He's been doing this work for over 20 years. He's processed LiDAR imagery from dozens of major archaeological sites on 4 continents. And he didn't know what to say. The spatial organization of the complex, the way the chambers relate to each other, the apparent intentionality of the corridor placement, suggests that this wasn't built incrementally over generations by different groups with different plans. The proportional relationships between spaces are too consistent. This was designed, possibly all at once, or at minimum according to a coherent master plan that was maintained across its construction. Design, planning, a master plan. for a structure that predates the cities of Mesopotamia by thousands of years. Here's the thing they don't put in the headline. This structure isn't alone, and its existence slots into a pattern of anomalous ancient sites that archaeologists have been quietly, uncomfortably debating for decades. Göbekli Tepe, which, if you haven't spent time with it, I'd strongly encourage you to look into, was the first major crack in the standard model. Discovered in the 1990s in southeastern Turkey, it pushed back the timeline for organized monumental construction by several thousand years. When it was first dated, the reaction from mainstream archaeology was essentially disbelief, followed by reluctant acceptance, followed by years of trying to fit it into the existing model without breaking the model too badly. Karahan Tepe, just 40 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, was already known to researchers before the 2023 discovery, but the scale of what lay beneath the surface was not. And now, with this new complex mapped, the region is starting to look less like a place where one anomalous site happened to appear, and more like a center, a hub, possibly the location of one of the earliest sustained human experiments in settled, complex social organization anywhere on Earth. Professor Ayşe Doğan, Director of Prehistoric Studies at Ankara University, has been cautious in her public statements, as most serious researchers are, but in a paper published in the Journal of World Prehistory in late 2024, she wrote something that I think deserves to be read carefully. She wrote, "The cumulative evidence from the Taş Tepeler region demands a fundamental reconsideration of the social prerequisites for monumental architecture. We may be looking at a form of complex social organization that precedes agriculture rather than following from it, which would invert one of the foundational assumptions of our discipline." Invert one of the foundational assumptions of our discipline. That's not fringe language. That's a senior academic in a peer-reviewed journal saying we may have had the sequence backwards. Mainstream archaeology didn't ignore this discovery. They did something in some ways more unsettling. They acknowledged it, then immediately began arguing about what it means. And that debate is genuinely interesting because both sides of it are being made by serious, credentialed people with access to the same data, and they're reaching dramatically different conclusions. The more conservative interpretation, held by a number of prominent archaeologists, including Dr. Richard Caulfield of Oxford School of Archaeology, is that the complexity of the site has been overstated. That what LiDAR is imaging as interconnected chambers may, upon full excavation, prove to be a series of related but distinct construction phases spanning many generations. That the foundation engineering, while impressive, can be explained by accumulated practical knowledge passed down within mobile communities over long periods. That we don't need to rewrite the textbooks, we need to add a more detailed footnote. That's a respectable position. It's cautious, it's grounded in methodological skepticism, and it's exactly what good science is supposed to sound like. But then there's the other camp. Dr. Shahin's team, along with a growing number of researchers who've reviewed the full dataset, argues that the conservative interpretation requires too many convenient assumptions, that you cannot explain the spatial coherence of an 11-chamber complex spread across 2 hectares as a series of independent generational additions, without those additions being guided by a consistent underlying plan. That the foundation engineering isn't just impressive, it's impossible to account for through accumulated folk knowledge alone, because the specific techniques used reflect an understanding of geological structure that requires deliberate, systematic observation over time. In other words, someone is thinking about this, long-term, systematically, institutionally. And that kind of institutional thinking is, according to everything we thought we knew, what civilization produces. Not what produces civilization. The argument is circular, and both sides know it, which is part of why the debate is so heated. When the carbon dating results came back from 3 independent labs, Oxford's Radiocarbon Unit, ETH Zurich, and a team from the University of Toronto, the numbers aligned in a way that nobody had anticipated. Not because they were wildly divergent, because they were wildly convergent. All 3 labs, working from different organic samples collected from different locations within the structure, returned dates clustering in a range that placed the earliest construction phase at approximately 11,500 years before the present. Give or take a few centuries. The margin of error on radiocarbon dating at this range is typically plus or minus 150 to 200 years, so we're talking about a genuinely tight cluster of results from independent sources. 1,500 years. For context, the earliest phases of Göbekli Tepe date to roughly the same period, which is part of what makes the regional picture so significant. But Göbekli Tepe's most complex enclosures are now believed to represent a later phase of construction. Some of the structural features at the Karahan complex, specifically certain foundational elements in what the excavation team has labeled Chamber 7, are returning dates that predate even those early Göbekli phases, which would make this, potentially, the oldest example of planned, multi-chambered enclosed architecture ever found on Earth. Dr. Thomas Reinhardt, the radiocarbon specialist who led the dating effort at ETH Zurich, was careful to note in his published methodology that organic samples from sites of this age can be subject to contamination effects that complicate interpretation. He ran the samples through multiple cleaning protocols precisely because he understood what the results were going to imply, and he wanted the methodology to be beyond challenge. "I needed to be certain," he said in a follow-up interview, "that if someone wanted to dispute these dates, they would have to dispute the physics, not the procedure. The dates have not been credibly disputed. The physics is the physics. If the dates hold, and right now there is no credible scientific challenge to them, then we need to fundamentally revise our understanding of when complex human organization began. And I want to be careful here about what I mean by complex human organization, because this is where the conversation can slide into overstatement very easily. I'm not saying this proves the existence of a lost advanced civilization in the science fiction sense. I'm not saying there were ancient technologies we've forgotten. What I am saying, what the evidence actually supports, is more nuanced and in some ways more remarkable than any of those claims. It suggests that the human capacity for complex social coordination, the ability to organize large groups around a shared, long-term project, to plan across years or generations, to develop and transmit specialized knowledge, emerged significantly earlier in our species' history than the standard model predicts, and that this capacity emerged not as a consequence of agriculture and settled life, as the textbooks tell us, but potentially as a precursor to it. Think about what that actually implies. We've always assumed that farming led to surplus, surplus led to population growth. Population growth led to the need for social organization, and social organization eventually produced the cognitive and cultural complexity required to build something like this. That sequence, that specific causal chain, is one of the most foundational ideas in the entire field of human prehistory. But what if the sequence runs the other way? What if the cognitive and social complexity came first? Not from farming, but from something else, some other driver we haven't fully identified. And agriculture developed later, partly as a way to sustain the kind of large, coordinated communities that complex ritual or architectural projects required. Some researchers, including Professor Harrington at UCL, have been arguing for exactly this inversion for years. The evidence from Göbekli Tepe pointed in that direction. The evidence from Karahan Tepe, if the dating and the LiDAR interpretation hold up under full excavation, points even more decisively in that direction. It doesn't rewrite human history. It reorders it. But there's a layer to this that goes beyond the structure itself, something the lead excavation team discovered in their third season that has barely made it into mainstream reporting. And honestly, when I came across this particular detail, it stopped me cold. Within Chamber 4, one of the interior enclosed spaces in the western section of the complex, the excavation team uncovered a series of markings on the interior wall surface. Not paintings, not the kind of representational cave art we associate with the Upper Paleolithic. Something different, something more deliberate. The markings are geometric, repeated patterns, specifically a recurring motif of concentric arcs intersected by parallel vertical lines, appearing multiple times across a wall surface of approximately 12 square meters. The same motif, rendered with consistent proportions in multiple locations on the same wall. Consistent enough that Dr. Shahin's team initially thought they might be looking at tool marks from the construction process. They're not tool marks. Dr. Valentina Russo, a cognitive archaeologist specializing in prehistoric symbolic behavior from the University of Bologna, was brought in specifically to assess the markings. Her conclusion, presented at the 2024 World Archaeological Congress and subsequently submitted for peer review, was unambiguous. These are intentional symbolic representations produced by multiple individuals over what appears to be an extended period, with a level of consistency that implies a shared symbolic vocabulary, a common visual language, among the people using this space. A shared symbolic vocabulary. In a structure 11,500 years old. among people we classified as pre-literate, pre-complex, pre-civilization. The implications of that take a moment to land. This isn't just engineering capability. This isn't just organizational capacity. This is evidence of symbolic culture, of a community that had developed shared abstract representations of concepts or beliefs and was using a built environment to express and preserve them. That is, by most definitions, the behavior of a civilization. Every great archaeological disruption in history, from the discovery of Troy, which people had assumed was myth, to the unearthing of Göbekli Tepe, which shattered the timeline for monumental architecture, eventually gets absorbed into a new, expanded understanding of who we are. The discomfort passes, the model adjusts, and we end up with a richer, more accurate, more honest picture of the human story. That process is beginning to happen now. Slowly, contentiously, with all the resistance and debate that genuine paradigm shifts always generate. But it's happening. What Karahan Tepe, and sites like it, and the growing body of evidence from this corner of Anatolia, is telling us is something that I find genuinely moving when I sit with it properly. It's telling us that the human impulse to build, to organize, to create shared meaning through architecture and symbol is older than we thought, significantly older. It was present in people who left no written record, no agricultural legacy, no dynasty or city-state we can point to. People who lived in a world so remote from ours that we can barely imagine it, and who nonetheless felt something that we still feel today. The need to make something that lasts. The need to gather together around something larger than any individual life. The need to mark, in stone, in symbol, in the careful engineering of a foundation that would outlast them by 100 centuries, that we were here, that we thought, that we organized and planned and created. That impulse is not new. It turns out it may be one of the oldest things about us, and that changes the question we should be asking. Not how did they build this? Not who were these people? But something larger and harder and far more interesting. What else did they build that we haven't found yet? The Tash-Tepeler region alone covers thousands of square kilometers. The LiDAR surveys completed so far represent a fraction of what's geologically possible to investigate. Dr. Webb's team, working with expanded funding from the European Research Council, began new survey sweeps in early 2025. The results of those sweeps, which cover 3 times the area of the original survey, have not yet been fully published. But at a closed academic session in late 2024, a colleague who attended told me that Webb described what the new data was showing as something we are going to be talking about for the rest of our careers. We may be standing at the beginning of a much larger discovery, not the end of one. Mainstream archaeology will keep arguing, as it should. The skeptics will keep demanding more evidence, as they should. A full excavation of a complex this size will take decades. The picture will keep changing, keep complicating, keep defying easy summary. That's how real science works, and it's frustrating, and it's also the only process we have that reliably gets us closer to truth. But right now, today, the evidence on the ground points towards something extraordinary. Something that asks us to hold our certainties a little more loosely. To remember that the story of humanity is vastly longer and stranger and richer than any single model can fully capture. 1,500 years ago, on a dry hillside in what is now southern Turkey, people gathered. They planned. They cut stone with a precision that still impresses geotechnical engineers. They built something together. Something that required trust, shared purpose, and a vision of the future that extended far beyond any individual life. We don't know their names, we don't know their language, we don't know what they believed exactly, or what they were trying to express with those concentric arcs on the interior wall of Chamber 4. But we know, they were there. And now, so are we, standing at the edge of what they left behind, trying to understand what they were trying to say. Maybe that is exactly what they intended.